Hello everyone, my name's Sue York and I'd like to thank you for all joining us here today. I'm speaking to you from Australia and today I'd like to talk to you about some things that quant researchers can learn from qualitative researchers. Now, rather than being a very prescriptive presentation, I'd really like to talk to you about some ideas I've had about the lessons that quant researchers can perhaps learn from qual researchers. Now, as I think we all know, traditional qualitative research is based on scientific research, and this means that we can conduct research with random representative samples and that these findings can be generalized from the sample to the wider population. Now, recently, we've started to realize that there may be a bit of a problem with this. Many people are starting to realize that it is very, very difficult to get a random representative sample in the bounds of commercial market research projects. And what does this mean? Does it mean that quantitative researchers should feel like this fish? Well, not necessarily. We know researchers who know something about non-representative samples, don't we? We call them qualitative researchers. Now, thinking about traditional market research, we have used quality measures such as validity and reliability. But if we move over to a paradigm of NewMR and non-representative samples, what are we concerned about? Qualitative researchers have a lovely term, trustworthiness. And as researchers, what we're really all looking for is that our findings are trustworthy. And trustworthiness encompasses a number of dimensions. Things like, is our research credible? Are our findings transferable? Are they dependable? And are they confirmable? Triangulation is another technique that qualitative researchers talk about a lot. And in fact, some quantitative researchers will find that they use triangulation techniques. They just won't necessarily know that they call them triangulation techniques. Now, triangulation really means that we're seeking to strengthen our study by combining our methods. We're really looking for more than one way of measuring something. And the term is really taken from the land surveying methods. Now, how can we triangulate our data? We can look for multiple sources of data. We can look for multiple people to investigate. We can combine multiple methods. And with all of these, we're not actually looking to see if we can find the same results. We're really testing to see if there's a consistency that will run through all our results. And this will, of course, make us feel more comfortable with our findings because they are more trustworthy. Now, when we move into the world of non-representative samples and think about approaches to sampling, qualitative research really has a lot of learning that we can incorporate in our quant research. It has many different techniques and approaches. We won't be able to apply them all directly, but some of them may inspire us. Some of them may be able to be adapted to what we would like to do, and some of them we will just be able to directly steal. Now, when we're talking about sampling strategies and thinking about qualitative research, qualitative researchers talk about having a purposeful sample, which I think is a fantastic term. You're actually selecting a sample that fits the purpose of your study. Mostly in qualitative research, that means talking to the people that you can learn the most from. Would we want to do that in quantitative research as well? And I think as we're starting to think about qualitative sampling strategies, the main thing to keep in mind for your quant study is, what are my study objectives? And that's a good way of starting to evaluate whether one of these sampling strategies will fit your approach. Now, an interesting form of sampling that is often used in qualitative research is something called extreme case sampling. And that's based on the idea that there are some people who, for a variety of reasons, represent very extreme cases of a phenomena. Now, it may be that they're extremely heavy users of a product. They may have been using it for a very long time. But by interviewing these people, you'll find that they have an incredible depth of knowledge, and maybe that is really useful to your study. Now, one of the drawbacks with extreme case sampling is maybe they are just too extreme, too crazy, too zany to really reflect the wider population. So in these cases, there's something called intensity sampling. It's similar to extreme case, but not quite as out there. So we may not be talking about the person who drinks 150 bottles of cola a day, but maybe somebody who's very brand loyal, has been using your product for a long time. And for that reason, they know a lot about the product, but they're not so different from the rest of the market as to have outrageous results. Now, another really interesting qual sampling technique is something called maximum variation sampling. And if you think about it in terms of these fish, if you interviewed all of these different fish and started to find that there were some themes that were really pertinent to all of the fish, you would start to feel quite confident that this might be something that would affect the whole market. So in our terms, if you interviewed consumers who were very different across a range of criteria that you thought were important for the sample, and you've started to find very similar results between them, you could start to perhaps hypothesize that these were things that were really quite dominant across all of the market. And then there's also a technique called typical case. This involves disregarding outliers, people who are different, and just looking at your real bread and butter typical customer. Now, this may not be always an appropriate technique, because as we know, there often isn't a typical customer. But if you're dealing in a product or service that really does have an average customer, and particularly if you've got data from previous studies or customer databases where you can start to pull out who are typical people and sample from them, that might be a really nice way of having a sample of people who you feel really comfortable projecting the findings of. Another interesting sample method to consider is the critical case. Now, possibly you're evaluating an ad campaign. Say it's been designed to target specific groups of people. Why not only interview those people? If you're looking at customers who have recently left, go and interview those who have just left and don't worry about the others. And I think one of the final things that we'll talk about today that qualitative researchers can offer to quant researchers is a concept called reflexivity. Reflexivity is about the researcher examining the role that they've played in the process. When quant research was relying on the fact that it was a more scientific approach, researchers tended to not worry about their role in the process, and this may or may not have been right. But as we start dealing with samples that aren't representative and even in different methods, we start to have a bigger impact on the process, and reflexivity is really about looking inward in many ways and thinking about what biases, subjectivity you may have brought to the process. And it may actually not just be the researcher. It could be beyond that. It could be the panel company that you're working with. It might be the client researcher. Everybody brings something to the research process, and they all have some impact on what we find. So I think this is certainly an area that you could read quite widely on in qualitative things, and you'll probably find it really useful. So that's really all the ideas I wanted to talk to you about today. But if you're interested in exploring some of these qualitative ideas, I think at the top of your mind you need to be remembering what the objectives of your study are. Some of these methods will offer a lot to projects, some will not be suitable for some projects. So it's a matter of really thinking about what you're trying to achieve and what benefit some of these other techniques can bring. I think it's nice to keep thinking about your data in terms of trustworthiness. Think about how you can triangulate your findings. Some ways of checking your data could really be quite simple in terms of looking at previous studies, published data, perhaps bringing an extra method into the project. Sometimes even having a second researcher review what your interpretation of the data is to see if they agree with you. As we are using non-representative samples more, I think it's important to think about how you are selecting your sample. Are there some alternative sampling strategies that you can start to use that might really add value to your project? And finally, think about reflexivity and think about how what you do impacts on the research project and the research findings. And thank you very much for listening today.